Hello, I'm Gina Cacceci, webinar host with CenterWatch. Welcome to today's webinar on Key Cost Drivers of Clinical Trials, a step-by-step guide to successful budgeting. This webinar is brought to you by OCT Clinical. OCT is one of the leading local CROs in the Eastern European region. They have been conducting clinical studies of different phases and indications for both big pharma and small biotech companies since 2005. We expect this session to last about 40 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Please feel free to prepare questions for our presenters. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the presentation, and the questions will be addressed at the end. To ask a question, simply type it into the area provided and press Enter. Questions will not be viewable to other attendees. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Irina Petrova is Director of Clinical Operations at OCT Clinical. Irina is a medical doctor with a degree in psychiatry and over 15 years of international clinical research experience. At OCT, Irina is responsible for the overall supervision of the clinical projects, assigning and training project teams, controlling their workload, and assessing their performance. She is joined by Anna Yanaeva, the Head of Business Development at OCT Clinical. She is responsible for communication with sponsors, preparation of proposals and study budgets, and making sure that all sponsors' needs are met by OCT. Thank you for joining us today. Ladies, you may proceed.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Gina. Good morning, everyone. And once again, thank you for joining us today on the webinar. So let's start. You all know how rapidly the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and as a consequence, the clinical trials market has been growing in the past 2 decades. Analytics of clinicaltrials.gov demonstrate that the number of registered clinical studies has grown more than 10 times in the last 10 years. And multiple sources show that the clinical trial cost has almost doubled since 2008. In the past 5 years, we have witnessed a lot of mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations that resulted in the transformation of the big CROs into the giant ones. And at the same time, the trend to outsourcing of clinical studies by sponsors has become stronger too. With this shifted market landscape, it is now more crucial than ever for sponsors to be specifically thorough and vigilant in planning the budgets for their clinical studies. That is why today we would like to share our experience and take a deeper dive into the structure of a clinical study budget, discuss the main cost drivers and ways of study budget optimization. We will also touch upon the real-life case studies on dealing with out-of-scope activities and costs, as well as ways to stay within the planned budget. As a bonus to all who join us today, at the end of the webinar, we will share a checklist of hidden costs that will help you plan and manage your clinical study budget most efficiently. So what does a typical budget consist of? The budget of any clinical study can be broken into 2 main big parts: cost of CRO services and pass-through costs. Pass-through costs, we usually use the abbreviation PTC, are all the costs that are passed directly to sponsor at actual expense. For example, travel, logistics or courier costs, cost of study supplies, cost of additional vendors if they are subcontracted by the CRO, and of course grant fees paid to the principal investigators and sites for the recruitment of patients. There is a false perception that the main part of a study budget goes to the CRO, while in fact over 50% of costs are pass-through costs and expenses that have nothing to do with CRO margin. Based on the analysis of the budgets of studies conducted by OCT, and that is over 300 in the past 15 years, we can say that on average, depending on the need for concomitant medication or supplies purchase, and the need for involvement of additional vendors like central labs, central imaging, ePro, and others, cost of CRO services may comprise around 40% of the overall study budget. So let us look at the structure of the CRO services cost. Normally, site management and monitoring cost is one of the highest in the overall structure of service fees. Then goes data management, biostatistics, and project management. The cost of services connected with medical writing and study approval, although very important in study organization, are normally lower, leaving quality assurance, pharmacovigilance, and logistics behind. So when we say logistics here, we are only talking about CRO support in coordinating the import and shipments of the investigational drugs, supplies and medications, while the cost of those shipments are pass-through costs, and they may actually comprise a serious part of the overall study budget. Now, as for the pass-through costs, undoubtedly sites and PIs grant fees for patients' enrollments may make up the largest part of the clinical study budget. Such costs as travel, logistics, medication and supplies purchase, as well as vendors' costs may vary depending on the study design and needs. And don't forget the regulatory authorities fees, as well as licenses fees for the questionnaires that are often used for primary and secondary endpoints assessments. Now that we understand the structure of a common clinical study budget, let us take a look at the main cost drivers that influence every part of the budget. And I will let Irina take it from here.
Thank you, Anna. Roughly, cost drivers can be divided into two distinct groups, the second of which derives from the first one, study design. Indeed, study design defines a lot in a clinical trial: timelines, budget, quality standards, operational details, organizational structure of the study. So let's look into the elements of study design. Sample size talks for itself. No need to explain anything here, I believe. Indication is an interesting topic, and it's not only about low or high incidence of a particular disease, it's also about particular eligibility criteria which may narrow down initially broad population. And it should be carefully assessed before study start to plan study timelines and number of sites, and thus the budget correctly. Trial competition in a particular therapeutic area also matters. For example, over the last couple of years, I would say we observed a significant increase in the number of studies in inflammatory bowel disease. The sites are overwhelmed, and of course it has negative impact on enrollment. We've followed by getting more and more requests for rescue studies and referral services in Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis studies launched some time ago and failing to close enrollment in time. At the moment, only our CRO has 2 referral programs ongoing, and the third one is under discussion. Duration of patient treatment and follow-up defines study timelines as well as enrollment. The longer the study is, the more expensive it can be. Complexity of study procedures may call for using a specific equipment, not usually used in routine practice, so there might be a need to purchase it specifically for the study. And sometimes it can be expensive to procure, deliver, and then, in the end of the study, collect it from the sites. The procedures may also lead to involvement of specific vendors, central labs of different kind, clinical imaging, central ECG, central pulmonary function test, and the like, EPRO, various adjudication committees, and IDMCs. Operational study structure, as I said above, also derives from the study design, and here are the main cost drivers within this group. Geography, geomix, the selection of countries where the study will be placed. Frankly speaking, study geography can be dictated not only by the study design, but also by the regulatory requirements of the target regulatory body, FDA or EMA. The important questions for country selection from the operational perspective will be the incidence of the disease in a particular area, as well as the treatment standards, whether the suggested eligibility criteria and treatment procedures are in line with the local routine practice, so that there won't be issues with the enrollment and with the quality of the data. What will be the treatment challenges? What will be the recruitment challenges? And finally, how many sites should be involved and how long enrollment will take? Talking about critical paths, we should not forget about processes which, if not completed in time, may block further study progress entirely. And sometimes this is not only the processes on the CRO side. It can be issues related, for instance, to the IMP manufacturing or method of laboratory assessments which need specific development and the like. This is usually under sponsor's control and not really depend on the CRO progress. In our experience, there were several projects which were launched with a significant delay because of that, and of course it had an impact on the budget. Once we had a case when the site opening was delayed for more than a year, and we had to reassess and replace some sites because the situation changed during this period. We completely reshuffled project team and had to repeat the trainings. And besides that, two competitive studies started recruitment in one of the countries. So many assumptions used for initial cost proposal changed, and the budget unfortunately increased. So now let's see the influence from a different angle, how various cost drivers affect different parts of the study budget. Indication and sample size through enrollment timelines and number of sites will have an influence on all services budgeted on a monthly basis. And depending on the site number, I'm mostly talking about site and project management. Logistics support depends on the number of subjects and sites directly. The more we have, the more shipments there will be, the more money we will spend. Same about data management. In general, data management budget strongly depends on the number of patients and sites. And probably in data management services, these are the most powerful cost drivers. Amount of monitoring will, of course, also depend on the sample size. As for the pass-through cost, we see that mostly investigators' grant and hospitals' fees will be affected. Here we should not forget about screen failures. If projected amount of screen failure is significant, let's say more than standard 10%, most likely investigators will raise a question about screen failure reimbursement in their grants. Another pass-through expense directly depending on the sample size is the cost of patient insurance. Treatment duration will again affect the cost of regular monthly activities and monitoring, as well as complexity of study procedures. The more data are collected within the study, the more monitoring hours are needed to check them. Also, complex and long study procedures, for example, overnight PK sampling or long infusions of chemotherapy, may require subject hospitalization, which will be, of course, included into hospital fee. The geo mix will definitely have an impact on the cost of regulatory support services. Each country has its own requirements for submission packages, and sometimes it can be a challenge to put it together. For instance, in Russia, the package is relatively easy to collect, but all documents should be translated into Russian language, which takes time and money. In Ukraine, the Ministry of Health requires a lot of documents from investigators, not only principal investigators, but from entire team. GCP certificates, professional certificates, diplomas, and the same, and the like, and the same about hospitals. Accreditation and certification of each medical institution involved in the trial have to be collected and reviewed for validity. Of course, collection of such packages takes more time and costs higher in respect to the services. Through clinical trial approval timelines, study geography has an impact on the cost of monthly services because in each country, so the duration of clinical trial approval is different. Also, it's not a secret that hourly rates of CRO may depend on the country. CRO, for instance, in Bulgaria, may have hourly rates 3 times lower than the CRA of the same experience and qualification in the United States. This is how the choice of the country may affect the overall study cost. Coming to the PTC, we see that regulatory submission fee may also vary significantly from country to country. Here in the slide is just an example that the difference can be really dramatic, many times higher in Russia than in Georgia, for instance. I've already mentioned the necessity to translate or notarize some documents or even the whole package. And it, of course, will also influence the cost of submission. It is also a well-known fact that the grant for the same amount of work and procedures may differ in different countries, sometimes even twice higher or lower, depends on which part of the world you are focusing mostly. We would say that per patient cost is usually rising, moving from east to west. And finally, in some countries, there might be taxes and duties for IMP importation, for example, in Russia. And in some cases, it can be significant amount indeed. Thinking about potential study risks, bottlenecks, and critical paths at the time of initial budget preparation is a very good practice. It helps to avoid unpleasant discussions in the middle of the study. If, let's say, something went wrong. For instance, you foresee potential difficulties with enrollment, then consider backup sites or maybe advertising campaign. You don't need to use this budget from the very beginning, but you will have this money already planned and allocated. And if enrollment is slower than expected, you can use them without additional pain and discussion. We always negotiate the risks at the beginning of the study and ready to budget appropriate contingency plans if this is agreed with the sponsor. And the last point on the slide is the overall study timelines. Timelines really has an influence on the services cost, and all services costs may be effective, but we believe that there is no direct influence on pass-through expenses if the scope of services accompanied by PTC, for instance, monitoring visits, they are associated with the travel cost. So if this is remain the same, there is no impact. We are often asked during bidding process to optimize or, frankly speaking, reduce the study budget. And we are always ready to look into the budget and carefully and to find an option for reduction. However, there are several things which, in our opinion, cannot be a subject to save on. First of all, this is medical writing and biostatistics services. Some minutes ago, I talked a lot about how important study design is, which impact it has on every aspect of the study budget, timelines, everything. But I didn't mention the main point. The entire study may fail due to improper study design or incorrect medical or statistical assumptions used for design development. Such mistakes may cost a fortune in the end. Every opportunity, external consultancy, or regulatory advice should be used to make sure that you are going to move into the right direction and get the result you expect. Also, this is not a good idea to count on grant fees. You may persuade the investigator to take part in this study, but you will see no patients and will hear a lot of different stories why enrollment doesn't go well at this site, whereas other trials with a higher grant in the same indication at the same site will not have such issues. And of course, and it's not surprising that I'm saying this, never try to save on CRO services. Never at all. Just forget about it. Sorry, I'm kidding. Surely it's always worth negotiating the budget with a CRO, trying to find ways to reduce the cost, to make sure together that the scope is the right one and no extra unnecessary services or expenses are included. CROs are usually welcome in the negotiations and feedbacks, but would be definitely not the right way to focus on selection of the cheapest offer and not checking it thoroughly. And in the end of the presentation, we will offer a checklist, some basic questions which should be asked during review of the budget proposals prepared by the CRO. If you look into how CRO puts together the study budget, you can see that in the basement of it there are hourly rates. Hourly rates derive mostly from expenses the CRO has. As a majority of service companies, the biggest part of these expenses are salaries. The more qualified and experienced the employee, the higher his or her salary, but at the same time, highly qualified CRAs and PMs will provide the work of better quality and will be more efficient and useful rather than an experienced, low-paid person. Another expense is HR costs spent for employee training, supervision, motivation, development, assessment, and qualification. It's all, if done properly, helps to retain staff in the company. The turnover rate in clinical department at OCT, for instance, fluctuates insignificantly around 10%. Change of key study team members, I mean CRA or project manager, is a standard point in our project-specific risk management plans. High level of retention of clinical personnel helps us to avoid this risk and increase the quality of services. I would also like to mention quality assurance costs. spent for maintenance of QA and QC system, quality assurance trainings, and audit expenses. Again, for instance, OCT performs 40 different audits annually, and only about 20% are the contracted audits. And finally, IT costs for maintenance of company IT infrastructure, utilization of validated electronic systems, which are used for better control and integrity of internal and study-specific processes, such as CTMS and electronic TMF. So I guess you would rather like to partner with a CRO which has established and traceable internal processes, CRO compliant with the international standards, CRO which has qualified, loyal, and dedicated clinical staff, and CRO using all benefits of modern technologies and developing with the pace of the industry.
Thanks, Irina. Indeed, these things are worth considering to decide. Would you like to work with a CRO whose quality management system is non-existent or exists on paper only? Would you like to work with a partner who has no proper IT structure or not utilizing CTMS systems? Are you willing to entrust your study to such a partner? So maybe instead, try thinking about using some other safer and less risky ways of budget optimization. For example, involving a smaller local CRO instead of or together with a global CRO. Such partnerships will often make the project more cost-efficient and successful, and choosing the right countries can also be a means of budget optimization. Like some regions, for example, Central and Eastern Europe, can provide high enrollment rates in many indications, along with lower per patient grant fees and while keeping the same high quality of data. So here is the example based on the multinational, multi-center studies conducted by OCT in Russia, while separate CROs were covering other Western countries. So we can clearly see that the enrollment rates were up to twice higher in Russia than in other countries. And so one of these drugs investigated has already obtained marketing authorization, and others are on the way. So once the regulatory and marketing requirements for country selection are met, let the CRO advise on the choice of countries that will optimize the study budget. Choosing a reliable CRO partner that you will entrust the efficient planning of the study is, of course, hard to overestimate. And again, being aware of the possible hidden costs will help you coordinate CRO work and mitigate the possible financial risks together with your CRO partner. However, life is life, and sometimes out-of-scope happens. Irina, could you please elaborate on the ways to effectively deal with it?
Yeah, sure. Indeed, especially in the long term, big studies, big international studies, it is really difficult to plan study budgets with 100% precision. So the project managers face the situation with out-of-scope occurrence. Project managers' actions in such situation are even described in our SOPs on project management. So first of all, in all cases when it's possible, we don't initiate out-of-scope services or prove out-of-scope pass-through expenses until this is authorized by the sponsor before. Why I said when it's possible? Because there is a situation when you must comply with the local regulations and act immediately. Let's take SUSARs, expedited safety reports. Of course, even if we are already exceeded the amount of SUSARs budgeted, we will proceed with submission regardless whether we already have additional agreement in place or not. Secondly, the project manager should not only present an issue of out-of-scope to the customer, but should also propose possible solutions. How to cover this expense and stay within the same overall budget? Difficult task, right? There might be some internal monetary resources if you look into the budget carefully and critically still. For example, you can change the monitoring plan and extend the window between the visits, but make the visits longer. I mean, instead of 1 day, 2 or 3 day visit. This is an opportunity to cut on travel costs, which in case of big countries like Russian Federation may be quite significant. Besides, the cost of 2-day visit services will be lower than 2 one-day visits. Or if you may look into the pass-through cost of the budget, part of the budget, and make reconciliation of travel and logistics cost spent up to date, and see whether you can reallocate some spare money from there. Or if the study is coming to an end and you have some unused service units and understand that they will never be used, for example, protocol amendment was budgeted but still the study is coming to an end, it will never happen, or serious adverse events were budgeted but didn't happen. So you can reallocate this money to out-of-scope activities or expenses. If there is no opportunity to find spare sums within the budget, then the only remaining options are probably either to avoid out-of-scope somehow or remove this responsibility from the CRO. And the last thing worth mentioning about out-of-scope is risk mitigation and contingency. So I always come back to this topic because this is really important. In some of our contracts, we have a certain % of allowed access for services or PTC or both. If out-of-scope occurs and fits the allowed access, it requires only approval from the sponsor's PM, which makes the process of out-of-scope negotiation much easier and faster. And we believe that this is a very good option to mitigate risks related to long out-of-scope authorization process.
Thank you, Irina. Well, of course, let's be honest, no one likes out-of-scope and budgets increase. So we would like to discuss the additional instruments that will help keep up with the initially planned budget. So analysis of the clinical studies performed by OCT in the past 3 years has resulted in the following statistics. In 76% of our projects, we have stayed within the initially planned budgets. Well, with 1 to 3% deviations, both decrease or increase of the budget, but we consider this acceptable. In 13% of cases, the amount of money actually spent on the study were even up to 9% less than initially planned. This happened due to faster enrollment sometimes. In other situations, there were some currency fluctuations, or it happened due to lower travel costs than planned for. And in 11% of our projects, the initially planned budgets were exceeded by up to 15%. There are also different reasons for that, starting from, again, currency fluctuations, change of cost of travel that we couldn't predict or plan for, or change of cost of IMP logistics. But one of the main reasons was the change of scope of activities and responsibilities initially budgeted for. So there is no secret pill that will guarantee that you stay within the budget. It is all about planning. And what helps us plan and calculate study budgets precisely as possible is, first of all, the experience of our team that is involved in the study budget planning at the stage of RFPs and bidding. As Irina mentioned previously, even if sponsor does not require that, we always ask our medical writers and biostatisticians to check and review the study design, check the sample size. We always conduct feasibility analysis prior to study budget calculation, and we actually base our budget upon it, upon the results of the feasibility analysis. We always involve the project manager along with Irina, who is Director of Clinical Operations at OCT, to review the study budget and approve it before we provide it to sponsor. Also, our logistics managers help plan the pass-through costs, such as travel and courier costs, as precisely as possible. And the last but not the least is the very detailed and transparent budget grid that we use to calculate the budget. So it is unit-based. It consists of over 400 lines, and it actually reflects all the activities that will be performed, in fact, within the project. It took us years to make it as accurate as possible, and of course, our 15 years experience and deep understanding of the cost drivers and possible risks or hidden costs definitely helps. So now we are glad to share this checklist of hidden costs with you, as we believe it can be helpful to you in your clinical trials budgeting, as well as in the analysis of your CRO partners' quotes. We have summed up those hidden costs into 4 groups. The first one connected with the right amount of services budgeted for. So ask yourself, do you think protocol amendment is possible? Are you sure the adequate number of serious adverse events, SUSARs, queries budgeted for? Same about the amount of monitoring days and visits. We also advise double-checking the central labs and other vendors' quotes together with your CRO partner, as well as the amount of medications and supplies to be purchased. Separate important group of hidden costs is connected with IMP management. That is something sponsor is often responsible for, and if you are not sure that the necessary amount of IMP will be manufactured at once and imported at once, make sure you budget for several imports and included all the custom duties to avoid a serious out of scope. As mentioned earlier, some countries may have local specific requirements for site fees, local ethics committees fees, taxes, and bank commissions, so your partner CRO should be responsible for double-checking that. And in order to protect yourself from unexpected changes due to currency fluctuations, think about considering plus minus 10% for pass-through cost deviations. So that's about all. We hope this was helpful, and we are happy to take questions now.
Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, now is your opportunity to have your questions answered by our presenters. Please remember this portion of the conference is also being recorded. To ask a question, you may use the question and answer panel on the screen. Type your question in the area provided and press enter. We have already received quite a few questions. We will get to as many questions as we can in the remaining time.
So let's see what questions we have. One of the questions is, how did your system or how does your system select sites and countries? I believe it's about the feasibility, so I will let Irina answer this.
Again, as every CRO, we have a standard operating procedure on that. First of all, we have a own database, which has been accumulated for how many years? 15 years we are on the market. We use CTMS system, and so all this information is kept there. Besides, we if it's possible, review through regulatory databases for already approved trial in the same indication. Such databases exist in Russia, for instance, and Ukraine. And also we use the method of recommendation of colleagues. If we contact one site and the site is positive about the study, we will go further and ask to recommend their colleagues. This is how we do. And then there is another question related to it, so how to optimize site and country selection. These two questions are interconnected, so I will answer this as well. We never do feasibility just in one country. Let's say we get a request for proposal, and even if the sponsor wants just one country in our region, so we always check several. We check treatment standards. It's easy for us to do because majority of project managers and myself, we are medical doctors, so we can search and understand the current treatment standard recommendations in each country. So we check that, and after we see that the protocol is in line with the treatment standard, there won't be any issues. So we pre-select several countries and then do the feasibility and then prepare the shortlist. 1 or 2 countries where the situation looks better in terms of enrollment, and then prepare a proposal for the sponsor.
Yeah, thank you, Irina. We have other questions. Let me see. So, what do you need to calculate the budget precisely? So, of course, we always try to get and hope to get as precise RFP and as precise information from sponsor as possible. And usually when we get an RFP, we get together with our internal team and make up a list of questions for sponsor to understand the scope of activities. So what we need is a synopsis, or at least some study design with eligibility criteria and sample size and the list of procedures for patients. And this is what we used for the feasibility analysis. And of course, the more transparent the allocation of responsibilities is, the more precise the budget is going to be. And another question also connected with study planning or budget planning is, how do you achieve such accurate PTC, so pass-through cost planning? Irina, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, sure. We have department on financial analysis, so financial department, and they actually maintain the statistics. So they monitor the PTC expenses on ongoing basis in the ongoing trials, and they update the rates and the prices, average prices for travel to different cities in different countries. So this lets us budget PTC with quite a good precision.
Thank you, Irina. I can see another interesting question here. When comparing RFPs, what are the critical budget factors to consider? I guess it's about comparing RFPs from different CROs.
The critical factor, I would say that all CROs would use the same, not assumptions, but the same study design, the same sample size, the same study procedures, because sometimes we get an RFP which starts with, please propose study design. Of course, different CROs may propose different study designs, and this is extremely difficult for a sponsor to compare apples with oranges, for instance. This is, in our opinion, the most important factors.
Yeah, thank you, Irina. Which payment schedule does OCT Clinical normally use? So I can comment on that. As for the pass-through cost part, normally they are charged on a monthly basis. As for the services side of the budget, well, of course, we always want to get paid on a monthly basis, but it doesn't always happen. We are quite flexible. We always discuss the payment schedules with sponsors in advance during the RFP process. So more often it is a milestone-based system of payment for services. But again, we are flexible and always discuss this. Let's see what other questions we have. How do you incorporate risk planning for budgeting?
Actually, I've already touched upon this a bit in my presentation. All depends how far the sponsor would like to go in planning and in risk mitigation budgeting, because you can identify a lot of risks, high risks or moderate risks, and if you and then you should decide which risks you would like to mitigate and allocate additional budget for that, which not. So our typical mitigations are additional sites. We always plan backup sites. The percentage depend on how much the risk of non-enrollment, how big it is, and we budget. We budget all activities for these backup sites until site initiation visits. So once we had a case when we budgeted even additional country, but this is not this is not frequent, and also some bonus system. So the most frequently we include additional measures to mitigate non-enrollment or slow enrollment. And this results in backup sites and sometimes in financial bonuses in the countries where this is possible and legal, or advertising campaign.
Thank you, Irina. One more question. What if there are no resources to mitigate risks? What can we say about that?
Meaning that there are no money for these mitigation strategies. Then, so usually we discuss with the sponsor what can be done. Sometimes if there is nothing, no money to mitigate the risk, you just can take it as it is and prepare a risk management plan to what will be your action if this risk happens. That's can only come from the discussion between the sponsor and the CRO.
Yeah. Another question: how inflation rates are factored into a study budget, especially for long-term trial? That's a good question. So as for the pass-through cost part, as we mentioned during the presentation, the webinar, it is worth considering. Well, based on our experience and the client's experience, plus minus 10% for the fluctuations. It actually touched upon both currency fluctuations and inflation as well. As for the services part, so it is well, it depends on how you discuss this with the CRO. For example, at OCT, we try not to change the hourly rates within the project because we believe it's the right thing to do. So if the project lasts for 3 or 4 years, we're not changing the initial hourly rates. Let's see if we have other questions. Duration affects program management fees. What if increase the number of subjects but maintain the duration? So I guess this question is about what if the number of subjects increases but the duration stays the same? Well, the first thing you will have to do is you will have to make the protocol amendments and submit it. So, well, normally it is.
Actually, there is no, in our budget, there is no influence and there is no connection between the number of subjects and project management. Project management depends on duration. If duration stays the same, project manager stays the same. But if to cover the bigger amount of subjects, you increase the number of sites or maybe add additional country, this of course will add to the project management. If this increase in the sample size is not significant, I would say that most likely the project management cost will not be changed. The monitoring, maybe yes, the number of monitoring visits will be increased, but if the number of countries and sites stay the same, project management will not change.
Yeah, that's right. And so if only the number of subjects has changed, then the only thing that changes in the budget is the cost of patient's insurance, but that's not a very big part of the budget. So
maybe DM cost will change because they really depend on the number of subjects, but not the project management.
Yes, that's correct. And we'll take one more question. How pandemic has influenced the budgets and due to which reasons? I can start commenting and go ahead and add something, Irina, if you want to. I can say that based on our experience, in many ongoing projects, budgets stay the same because we try to allocate the activities as much as we can. For example, in some studies, well, obviously we couldn't do the on-site monitoring visits, so we had to do it remotely, which is allowed in Russia. But on the other hand, data managers had to spend more time on query resolution, and so in the end, the cost was just reallocated. We saved some money on the travel, and we used it for additional hours of monitoring, remote monitoring, and additional hours of data managers for queries resolution.
Yeah, for studies which were entirely put on hold, there were not so many in our company, maybe just 1 or 2. In one study, enrollment was stopped completely. This was a decision of the sponsor, but actually there were some patients enrolled, and we had to continue site management and project management to support those sites and patients which were in treatment period or in follow-up period during pandemic. And another study, we just put on hold the site initiation visits until the situation resolved. Actually, the budgets also did not change somehow because in the study where we delayed initiation, no activities took place, so there was nothing to charge the sponsor for.
Yeah, that's right. And there's one funny comment. You might make the point that the CRO cannot save the sponsor from sponsors' inability to plan effectively their trials. Well, yeah, that's a good point to make. Yes, all we can do is help sponsors plan.
Yeah, actually, we really do a lot of questioning before we plan the budget, because sometimes this is a very good comment that we don't have the full information about about the internal plans. As I gave you examples about IMP manufacturing, usually the sponsor is not usually, but sometimes the sponsor is not open about it, and so we are moving forward, but still, reach some point, and then nothing happens because there is no IMP produced. But anyway, so what we can do as a CRO, especially with the small companies which don't have a lot of expertise in clinical trials, I mean sponsors, so we help them to come to this understanding what is needed from them to plan the budget and the study correctly.
Yeah, because in the end we understand that we have to share responsibility, and we share the same goal as sponsor does, so try to help them plan as efficiently as possible. So we are all done with questions. And again, thanks a lot, everyone. We really hope that you enjoyed the webinar. We hope that you found it helpful. So best of luck to you in your future studies, and please feel free to reach out to us with more questions or with any queries.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of CenterWatch and OCT Clinical, I would like to thank our participants for joining us today. Please be sure to fill out the survey at the conclusion of this webinar. Your feedback is very important to us. This now concludes today's webinar. Have a great day, and I hope you join us again in the future.